Hi. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming down, and I'm glad that everyone is very interested in learning about the BRICs and learning about China. As Heidi mentioned, I'm an editor at Foreign Policy magazine, also fellow at the New America Foundation, and since 2007, my reporting is focused on China, specifically China and the environment. And so I've traveled not just in Beijing and Shanghai, but in a lot of West China, visiting a lot of big cities of 32 million, and also very small villages of just a few dozen people. And I've really seen China from a lot of different angles, and I'm really happy to be able to share some of those experiences with you. I thought I would just talk briefly about some of the things that we hear about China in the news, some broad themes: are they right, are they wrong, what they get wrong about China. And then really to open it up to questions, because I most want to be useful to the things that you guys want to know. And so with that, I thought I would just start with a few things. It seems that you can't turn on the news these days without hearing about China. Yesterday, one of the top headlines was that they're going to likely to revalue their currency, of course, since the Olympics. The Shanghai Expo, we've just seen nonstop images of China, and it's sometimes a little bit difficult to make sense of it. So the first thing I wanted to say that I think is really important when introducing people to China for the first time is we use China as shorthand, but China, the government, and China, the people, are very different. I think it's really important, when you say China did this, China wants this, China is moving in this direction, to clarify whether or not you're talking about the government or the people, because obviously for political reasons there's a lot of sort of concern about the government, but the Chinese people they agree with their government sometimes, and sometimes they don't. And I think it sounds like a small linguistic point, but is really important whenever you read something. China doesn't care about the environment. Are we talking about the government, or are we talking about the people? China wants to compete with the U.S. Again, it's really important, especially if you have the opportunity to lead school trips to China, and people get to meet Chinese, your students get to meet Chinese people, to have that distinction be clear. The second thing I really wanted to emphasize is that China is a lot more diverse than we think. China is a very big country. It's about the size of the continental United States, and just as the landscape of America is very different in the pine forest of the Northwest and the deserts of Arizona and the beaches of Hawaii, so too does China have just an amazingly diverse, stunning landscape. There's of course, the old Silk Road, deserts, you're facing problems with desertification and water, the sort of epic mountains and mist of Sichuan province. It's a very lush, fertile land. Of course, the rice paddies of southern China. And so even when people envision China, I think, to understand how big and how different it is. And of course, with 3,000 years of continuous civilization in a country that big and diverse, the people are very different, and they have different habits and cultures. If you ask Beijingers in Shanghai about each other, people in Shanghai will say, oh, people in Beijing, they're too closed, they're political, they're operators. I guess maybe the way New Yorkers think of Washingtonians. But if you ask people in Beijing what they think of Shanghai, they care too much about money and this and that. And so the different places in China have different senses of local identity. And I think, again, when we try to guess sort of what will China be in the future, how is it evolving, to understand how different it is. I mean, it's just like Iowa is different than Montana, is different than Boston. In western Sichuan, Sichuan is one of the provinces in the west. In West China, people are very fiery and spicy, and they like their food hot and their discussions hot, and they like to debate. And so all of our stereotypes maybe about, Chinese people sort of being quiet or reticent are not true. They're the opposite of true when you're in this sort of very boisterous, lively part of China. And again, I think for people to get an understanding of sort of just the texture of the place, it's important to keep that in mind. Of course, also, financially, China is extremely diverse. We now see images quite often of, someone in Shanghai who's never worn the same clothing twice for the last, year. There's a National Geographic article that led with someone like that. It's fun to focus on extremes. Certainly there are people in China who are becoming extremely rich. But there's also people in China who are very poor, and the tension between rich and poor is, I think, going to be one of the important defining aspects of China in the future. Also, of course, we see pictures of cities, but still more than half of China is rural. That means, people who are still farmers, who are small merchants. Over the next 20 years, it's expected that 350 million people, that's more than the entire population of the United States, 350 million people are going to move from villages in China into cities. So imagine if the entire United States went from being farmland to being New York in 2 decades. That's the kind of transformation that China is facing. And of course, there's people at every level of that. Some people who are already living in Manhattan, and some people who are, just I guess sort of on the Oregon Trail, as it were. And so, again, when we think about China, just to understand the diversity of human realities, and then also, if you're a government and you're trying to provide health care for these people at all these different sort of stages of development and needs, it's really an enormous challenge. So there's many ways to think about it, but I just want to convey that China is an extremely diverse country in many, many ways. Another sort of thing that we hear about in China often is, well, China's an authoritarian government, so if the government wants something to happen, it happens very quickly. So, for example, the Olympics, we all look at the Olympic opening ceremony and think, my goodness, look at how they've organized this so quickly, and it seems just very sort of flawless. If you read Tom Friedman's columns in the New York Times, he often will talk about, China's advantage in developing infrastructure or clean energy because they're an authoritarian government. It's true that unlike, say, Washington, we don't have the same deliberative process, open deliberative process. But I think it's important for people to understand how much of a difference there is between what gets decided in Beijing and what actually happens in the provinces. China is, for people who've lived in China, it's a very chaotic society. And I think it's just important to know that there's a difference between sort of seeing a news article that says the government in Beijing decided to do this and imagining that it'll happen overnight, because it really won't. There's a lot of individual autonomy that provincial governors have. I mean, imagine 50 Arnold Schwarzeneggers governing their own states, and they all have their own sort of agendas and cults of personalities and ideals, and they're very different than what Obama is saying in Washington. China is not the same political system by any means, but there's a lot of variance regionally, and so quite often, again, when something is decided, it seems intimidating to Americans because we think, wow, they can do that so fast. How can they muster so much money? How can they transform to clean energy overnight? And I think it's really important whenever you see news articles saying Beijing has decided to do so-and-so, that you also look for news articles that say, okay, how far are they along on meeting that goal? The same as you would, if Washington makes a decision, okay, is that really what's going to happen in the place that I'm, that I am and that I'm experiencing? And again, one of the reasons I like to break down that myth is I think people often find China scary or unapproachable because they imagine everything is sort of almost mechanical tick-tock, and it's really, really quite the opposite. One just sort of small example is that a few years ago, Beijing decided to institute a charge on plastic bags, the idea being to cut down on waste. And, overnight, almost, in Beijing for a period of time, that was enforced. But if you traveled anywhere else in China, things take a while to sort of get through the system, and maybe one mayor, it would be his cause to sort of take up the environment and reduce waste. And so he would make sure it was really enforced, but you travel to another city and it's not. And again, it's just small things like that. But China is not as sort of snap to it as we might imagine watching, PLA parades. Another thing I think is really important is this idea that especially we hear in Washington, and maybe you guys can tell me where you're from, if this seems as constant a theme, but there's often an idea here that China is directly competing with the United States. Certainly in terms of jobs in Washington, there's a lot of concern about clean energy, and China is often sort of spoken as a rival. It's not the case that the government in China is thinking about the United States the way the United States government is thinking about China. And what I mean by that is, again, think about taking the entire population of the United States from village life to Manhattan in 2 decades. That's the focus of the Chinese government right now, and all the things that entails. Of course, they also have to worry about providing energy and resources, and so you might hear stories of, I've seen news stories about projects to extract oil and mineral from Africa, from Afghanistan even. When Hu Jintao gets his daily brief, I can promise you that almost all of the sort of top-level items are domestic issues. They aren't foreign issues. Whereas when Obama gets his sort of daily briefing, it's going to be first about Afghanistan and Iraq, and now BP, the oil spill in the Gulf. But he's able to focus more on foreign issues. Whereas, of course, China is sort of feeling out its way in terms of foreign policy. But really, its focus, at least for the next 2 decades, is going to be in internally making things work. Of course, that requires it to go outside its borders. But I think it's important to know that whatever China is doing right now, it's motivated principally by how do we keep this development working, not by, oh, we want to be a rival with the U.S. or some other sort of geopolitical sort of calculus in that way. Another sort of thing that I often sort of pick up, again, just a broad theme that sort of seems to be an undercurrent in a lot of news reports, is China becoming more like the United States? They've got McDonald's, they've got KFC, people are getting wealthier, they're shopping more, and I think. And the other sort of side of the spectrum is, China is so different. They've been different for 3,000 years. They can never be anymore. The West and China are inherently sort of different, and we can't really understand each other. And of course, I think the answer is somewhere in between. As people have more wealth, they have more options. They're able to figure out not just how do I survive, but what do I want to do? What do I want to choose? What do I want from my child? And that's just a universal human trait. And of course, as people have access to more money, more clothes, more Hollywood movies, more Chinese-produced movies, there is a sense in which, the Chinese people are becoming more, I should say, cosmopolitan. I won't use the word Western. Of course, in other ways, China has its own sort of very distinct culture. It's sort of, if you've ever spoken to anyone who's doing business in China, you have to have lunch or dinner, and dinners go on forever, and you have to, sort of hang out for 5 or 6 hours and eat everything they put in front of you and drink the baijiu, and which is the very strong sort of wine, and sort of be a good guest. And what's important for doing anything, and I'm using business as an example, but really for anything in China, is first establishing a relationship. So, you're going to go to 6 or 7 endless dinners before you're even going to sort of talk about deliverables. Whereas, if you're from Washington, you want to, okay, well, what are we going to get out of this meeting? And here's my agenda. And the Chinese people will be like, wait, I don't know you yet. We're not going to talk about anything until I feel like I have established a relationship. Those are cultural differences, and I don't see those disappearing over time. I think it's important that we Americans understand sort of what are the expectations of Chinese people we meet with, and likewise that Chinese people, are very interested in. There's a lot of courses in American business etiquette, but there are those cultural orientations that I think will prevail. Now, they aren't opposed necessarily in that case. It's just sort of subtle differences that I think are important. And then I guess the last thing I wanted to address, and then, again, have you sort of ask me questions and to know what's most interesting to you. But we have lately seen a lot of headlines about China's projects extracting minerals, oil, other resources from Africa, from Afghanistan. And often sort of the undercurrent is China becoming sort of a new colonial empire. Now, again, think about all those people who are moving to cities. China is now the leading, consumer of wood, of cement. I mean, just it's an immense building project. China's energy needs, water needs. I mean, when anyone goes from a sort of simple lifestyle to a city lifestyle, I mean, your need for all sorts of resources just increases. And so China not having that much resources in the inside of China has, I think, the World Bank has an average of sort of how much water per capita, most countries have around the world. And I think China has about 1/6 the average, okay? And they're needing more and more water. There's a lot of attention to energy, but I think actually that water is going to be the biggest resource challenge for China. And that's not something that, by the way, they can import from outside. You can't ship water the way that you can ship oil. And I was in China this summer and talked to someone in Beijing who's actually advisor for the Beijing Green Olympics, and he said to me personally, water is the biggest resource challenge for the growth of Beijing. So I wanted to just give you a sense of, so you're a government minister in Beijing, and maybe you're a good guy, maybe you're a bad guy, but you have an immense practical challenge to make possible this continued urbanization. And the only sort of what your options are to think about conservation, which it is beginning to trickle, but also to fund these projects, in sort of inhospitable places like the Sudan, okay, where you're extracting resources, especially rare minerals and oil and timber from Latin America. And so China's resource challenges are really reshaping a lot of the planet because China needs those resources to continue to grow. It's a tricky issue to discuss because, of course, this results in a great market for illegal logging in much of Latin America. We think of Latin America as our backyard, but a lot of the logs now being cut down. The money's not always going to nice people. Those logs are going to build new apartment buildings in China. Southeast Asia, Burma. Burma's not a very nice government, but a lot of transactions happen so that minerals and especially timber grown in Burma can go to help China with its development. Africa, there's talk about sort of if the 19th century was the Europeans dividing up Africa, what role will China play in Africa? Because quite often, in order to have the ability to extract oil in places, it has to do deals with governments that certainly aren't on the UN's best friends list. It's a really tricky thing to talk about because it's very easy to vilify China, but part of the reason that China is seeking resources in places that are difficult is because it doesn't have that many options left to it. I mean, I'm sure it would love to have a Canada-friendly, peaceful neighbor to the north. Canada, for all we hear about Saudi Arabia, Canada is actually the biggest foreign supplier of oil to the United States, and we have a friendly, peaceful relationship. And that's a great thing for the United States. It's the luck of geography. I'm certainly not condoning any of the decisions that the Chinese government is making, but just to give you a perspective on really some of the difficult choices that they're having to make. And everything about China, it's just imagine American history, just because most of us I think are Americans, but imagine the history of sort of modernization, but just on fast forward. And so it's just a challenge that no country has had to deal with, in a similar way. And so there's not really a blueprint. And that's unsettling in a way to us. It's unsettling to people in China, too. China and India have different development paths, and if anyone's interested, we can talk about that. But I just wanted to, again, touch on some of the broad themes that I hear and sort of address from my own time in China what I think is true and not true and where things are more complicated. And I guess you guys have probably gathered from the way that I talk about China, I'm not pro-China or anti-China. I mean, I have wonderful friends in China. I have caveats and concerns about certain policies of the government of China. But the rise of China is a fact. And so it's something that we, people in Washington, the government, but also people who are teaching the next generation of Americans have to reconcile and understand what it means. Not is it good or bad, but how will it affect us, and what role can we play? Can we inspire our young people to play